Remember this guy from The Godfather? He played Mo Green, I think it was. His name is Alex Rocco, his acting name. His actual name is Alexander Federico Petriconi Jr. He was born in 1936 in Somerville, Mass. He was known up there by by a nickname Bobo. He was a big guy, Rocco Bobo, and he had connections, deep connections with the Winter Hill gang in the late 50s, early 1960s. He's an Italian American, obviously, but he was a suspect in the 1961 murder of Bernie McLaughlin, another Irish gang. And he moved to California after he slipped out of that one, and he began to use the name Alex Rocco. He just took his two names and combined them. And he lost, obviously, as you can see in these photos, a considerable amount of weight. And then he went on to play Mo Green, a lot of other things. There is a story going around that the Winter Hill, the Irish War started because he was going through what they call in New England a time, with like a thing they have in the summer, outdoor party. And somebody grabbed his girlfriend and one thing led to another. That's really not quite accurate. The Irish War started on September 2, 1961, in the middle of a Labor Day celebration. Georgie McLaughlin, who was a punk from Charlestown, he had grabbed, Charlestown is outside Boston, he had grabbed the breast, if you can believe this, of the wife of a guy named Bill Hickey, who was a powerful Somersville, Mass. Teamster boss and also associated with the Winter Hill gang. So Hickey, and he had a friend named George Red Lloyd, pounced on McLaughlin, of course, and for grabbing the guy's wife. Fight broke out. McLaughlin caught the worst of it. They broke his jaw, they fractured his elbow, busted his nose, closed one of his eyes. So when it was all over, he was knocked out. They couldn't find a pulse. So this is a problem because McLaughlin dead was just bad news everywhere. His brothers, Bernie and Punchy, they were older. Just think, his brother's named Punchy. Think about that for a minute. They ran the rackets in Charleston, and if anything, they were going to come for revenge one way or the other. Bernie McLaughlin, he was a loan shark and a leg breaker for the Anganula gang up in Boston, over in Boston proper. And his brother Punchy was a psychotic former boxer. He was prone to violence, and he would use violence to settle even a minor dispute. So they think, great, we've killed the brother of these lunatics. They toss him in the back seat. They're looking for a dark road to throw the body out. And suddenly McLaughlin wakes up, where am I and so forth. They knock him back down and they drive to a nearby hospital, and the Andrew Keaton Hospital, and they toss him out in front of the emergency room. I've seen that done before. And they take off, right? So Georgie comes around, his brothers are there, and they're fit to be tied. And they want to know who did this, what happened, tell me every freaking detail. So he points to Hickey and Lloyd, the guys who beat him up, who are known to be with the Winter Hill gangs. And so the McLaughlin brothers have a serious problem with the Winter Hill's leader, Jimmy McLean, James Buddy McLean. So they comb the streets, the two brothers who could walk, comb the streets of Somerville. They're looking for Lloyd, they're looking for Hickey, they can't find him. Obviously, they've gone underground. Finally, they walk up to Buddy McLean. Again, this is the guy who runs the Winter Hill gang. McLean, a big, big guy. And they said, look, we need you to help find Lloyd and Hickey for beating up our brother and turn him over to us, or you can give him a severe beating yourself. And he said, look, from what I heard, well, for one thing, I'm not going to set up two guys who are friends of mine, but from what I heard, your brother was way out of line. So it was an argument. They leave. They just said, we're not going to put up with this. Several nights later, Buddy McLean, the guy who turned them down, his wife hears a sound in the back. She sends the dogs out. She get out to look. She sends the dogs out. There's somebody fooling around with her husband's car. Buddy runs out there. He's got a German Luger in his hands, and the guys run away. He fires off a shot, though, in the middle of a suburban neighborhood, and he chases these guys. And he's positive that it was Bernie McLaughlin was one guy that he saw when he went under a streetlight. So it was McLaughlin. And They take off, and the next morning, so he's livid. He's fit to be tied. McLean goes out the next morning. It's October 31, 1961. McLean steps out of his Oldsmobile in Charlestown Square. And there he is. There's Bernie McLaughlin. He's standing actually right next to a police station. He pulls out a shotgun and he blows off the back of his head. Dozens of witnesses. Everyone see he doesn't make any attempt. Well, he did make an attempt to hide it. He opened his trunk of his car so that they couldn't get his license plate. McLean is arrested a short time later. Buddy McLean's arrested a short time later in a Somerville donut shop having a coffee with an off-duty Metro cop named Russ Nicholson and this young punk who we know now is Alex Bobo Piccaroni. They got a jury together. They're going to indict him for murder and so forth. But the case went away. They couldn't make the case. The witnesses disappeared. Nobody knew nothing about nothing. Nicholson, the cop, well, for one thing, that was when Alex Rocco took off to California and became an actor. He was in, by the way, a film called The Friends of Eddie Coyle. If you can't see the film, man, read the book. What happened with the cop, the former cop, was Nicholson. He wasn't so lucky. About a year later, July 1962, the cops dug up his bones. They were building a new shopping center, a place called Wellington Circle down in Medford. And that was it. The Irish Wars were on and ready to go. And the case has never been solved, by the way. '14th, 1964, George McLaughlin is recovering from a beating, which you'll see in part one, that he had gotten earlier, and he decides to go to St. Patrick's Day party that was held at the second floor apartment, 55 Yeoman Street in Roxbury. Boy, was Roxbury a different place then. So he goes to his friend there, Maureen Delamano, and the two of them go upstairs to the party on the second floor. William Sheridan is a 21-year-old Dorchester bank clerk. He's otherwise an innocent kid, but he did bear a striking resemblance to one of the guys who beat up McLaughlin. And the more McLaughlin drinks, the more he's convinced that this William Sheridan is one of the guys who beat him up. He's going to confront him, but Sheridan left the party. There had been it got pretty rowdy. They were all drunk, and there had been an argument or something, so he left. Shortly before midnight, the tenant at the second floor apartment tells everybody, get the hell out. These young guys have been drinking just too much. They got rowdy. There's a fight. She threw them out, but the boys all gather on the second floor landing. It's a walk-up. And they continue their drinking there, and they're loud and yelling and screaming. McLaughlin comes out. He says, yeah, clear the hallway. Words are exchanged. He goes downstairs to straighten these guys out. Somebody punches him. He just thinks, I'm not going to deal with this again. He goes downstairs to Delamano's apartment, comes back up in a few minutes, points a gun at everybody, and then this kid realizes, oh my God, this is one of the McLaughlin brothers, and they run. McLaughlin goes down after them down the stairs. He gets to the front of the apartment house. Just at that moment, William Sheridan's returning to the party. There's words, nobody knows what was said, but McLaughlin just put an end to it all. He shot Sheridan dead using a .350 Magnum, probably. Russ Nicholson, again, you'll see this in part one, was an off-duty cop, gangster, really. He, Buddy McLean, Bobo Piccaroni, who was the guy in The Godfather, they had been arrested in 1961 for the murder of Bernie McLaughlin. The three had found Bernie in Charlestown in front of the Morning Glory Cafe, and they shot him dead. Buddy McLean did the actual shooting in front of about 100 witnesses. Nobody saw anything, and within a stone's throw of a police precinct. So Nicholson was also a suspect in the Plymouth mail robbery. If you go on my site here and put in Plymouth, P-L-Y, Plymouth mail robbery, P-L-Y, M-O-U-H, the Plymouth mail robbery, and it's pretty good. It's a long tape, but it's apparently Nicholson was involved with that, and what had happened was he was a cop, Boston cop. And whoever stopped the mail truck that day there were two of them, were wearing police uniforms. And so, and then there were drawings that pretty much looked like him and so forth. So perhaps he was killed in retribution for the McLaughlin murder, but on the other hand, maybe they're afraid he's going to talk, or maybe they just want to share the loot with him. So he ends up dead. In May, Frankie Benjamin's headless torso was found stuffed into a trunk of a stolen car. Jimmy the Bear Flemmi ran into Frankie at a bar in Dorchester, and they go drinking together at a place owned by this gangster, Wimpy Bennett. So at one point, they're both pretty drunk at this point. This is Boston after all. Frankie starts shouting about how he's with Buddy McLean, and that McLean has chosen him personally to go out and kill members of the McLaughlin gang. Well, this does not sit right with Flemmi because he's with McLaughlin, and so is Wimpy Bennett. So Flemmi gets up out of his stool, walks over to his car, gets his gun, comes back in, boom, shoots Frankie in the head. They toss him into the bar's kitchen. They think, well, we'll deal with this. We'll decide what we'll do. They come back in a little while later, and there's Frankie still alive. He's got a couple of holes in his head, and he's crawling towards the floor. Blood all over the place. So Wimpy Bennett thinks, he takes his gun, and he shoots him. This time he kills him. They're very close range, and he blows off a big portion of his head. And all that is his brains and more blood on the floor. So Bennett is looking at this, and he's thinking, there's no way to clean this up on time. Not only that, the gun that was used was a cop's gun. They had some, I don't know how, gotten their hands on a cop's gun. It was just a matter of time before ballistics could trace. They'd dig in his head and pull out the bullet, and who knows what that could lead to. So they thought, well, we'll just torch this place. And they set it on fire. Then they took the body out. They chopped his head off with the theory, no head, no ballistics, which kind of didn't really work out for them. But anyway. So on May 12, 1964, Punchy and Georgie McLaughlin, they find Russ Nicholson, the cop. They drag him to his car. They drive him to the woods in Wilmington, Mass., and they shoot him twice in the head. I forgot to tell you that part. The McLeans retaliated on August 1964. Buddy McLean, just gotten out of prison on another charge, murders this guy, Harold Hannon, and another guy, Willie Delaney, who were kind of sort of with the McLaughlin gang. But it's more complicated. Delaney and Hannon, they got lured to a South Boston apartment with this young woman. She said, come on over, I'll show you a good time, whatever. And who's there when they arrive but Buddy McLean and his guys. They torture Hannon with a blowtorch. They burned off his genitals. And then they strangled him with something called a Chinese torture knot. I don't know what that is. It's in the report. So Delaney, the other guy, was just apparently some guy was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been a friend of Hannon's, but I guess where you got to go now. So they took some mercy on him. They stuffed Seconals down his throat, gave him whiskey, and then they shot him. So maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. Police doubt that part of the story, and their argument is that Delaney was just left half alive and tossed in a bag, and he drowned in the Boston Harbor where they found both these bodies. Hannon's crime, the first guy they killed, they took off his testicles, that guy, it may have been that he took part in a break-in in the home, a North Shore home. North Shore is a really nice place, of this bookie, and they made off with $100,000 in cash that didn't belong to the bookie, it belonged to the mad guys who backed him up. And listen to this. He stole 25 expensive suits. After they killed Hannon, they went to his house and they got these suits, and they took him out of there. So when it was time for the corpse, when Hannon's corpse to be buried, the wife or family, whatever, went in his closet. They couldn't find a suit, so they went back to Hannon and said, "Look, give the guy one suit for his funeral." In July, two gangsters from Providence were found dead: Paul Colisi and Vincent Bessesi. They were both shot in the head while they were kneeling down. They were in kneeling position. Then they crammed their bodies into Colisi's trunk. Colisi was from Providence. He was a former boxer. He had a long record, possession of deadly weapons, running handbooks. He did a 12-year stint in 1948 for taking $200,000 in jewelry from the home of Mrs. Richard Coffin. She's the former wife of the writer Damon Runyon. Bessie was also a Providence. He was a salesman. He didn't have any record. BCC, one investigator said, is as clean as a whistle, and as far as we know, we can't tie these two together. Both have been dead for about 3 days when their bodies were found. The last report the police had on this was that they had been hanging around the north end of Boston for several weeks selling air coolers, and there had been reports about them that what they were actually selling was the air coolers were calling them air conditioners and just conning, stupid con. And that's all anybody knows. So, Georgie McLaughlin, at this point, he's still on the run for murdering the kid Sheridan. But he was suspected of being the shooter in that case. At that point, word on the street was that Georgie was traveling around Boston and hiding with a loaded machine gun at his side at all times. So Vincent Flemmi was shot by the McLaughlins in Dorchester, Mass. On September 3rd. This is ex-con Willie McCarthy, who may have been a friend of Flemmi's. It's not really clear. He was arrested. I guess if you're going to shoot somebody, get his friend to do it. You can get up close. They arrested him, but they released him. Flemmi had been in a bar, once again drinking. It's Boston after all. And he walked outside in his passage. He said a station wagon drove by and shot him in the hip. Witnesses off record said no. This guy, McCarthy, just walked up and shot him and ran. On September 2, Leo Lowry, they called him Iggy Lowry. He's an ex-con. He's found dead. They slashed his throat and shot him in the back of the head twice. He was also badly beaten. The killer was Jimmy the Bear Flemmi. Lowry was known as associate of this guy, Ronnie DeModi, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who was killed the following day. And the beheaded Frankie Benjamin, he's pals with them. Lowry's record included convictions for breaking and entering, larceny, standard bad guy stuff. He escaped from Deer Island House of Corrections in 1951, so they tossed him in the Charles Street Jail downtown, and he broke out of that in 1952. After that, there was the murder, as I said, of Ronnie DeModi. It's D-E-R-M-O-D-Y. DeModi is how I would say it. It's an Irish name. It's this bizarre story. DeModi had a record that spanned 2 decades. He was sentenced to 17 years in a federal prison in 1956 for a $42,000 bank holdup in Rhode Island. DeModi was killed on September 4, 1964, around 11 at night. He was sitting in the car, driver's car, and he was stopped at a light. He had the window halfway down on the passenger side. So one theory was somebody was in the car with him, shot him. The other one is whoever came by used the open window and put the shots through the window. 4 slugs. 3 of them hit him, hit DeModi in his neck, and then passed out the left side of his head. So DeModi had just spent 8 years in federal prison. He was back in the street for about 4 months when they got him. This is why this story is bizarre. So he had been dating this woman named Dottie Barchard, for God's sakes. She's the girlfriend of this really bad guy named Spike O'Toole. O'Toole was a McLaughlin associate. He is also the father of Dottie's 2 kids. So DeModi, at this point, he's in love with Dottie. And according to those who knew him, he figured out loud, stupidly, I don't have any chance with her while O'Toole is still running around alive. So for his part, O'Toole was a very hardened criminal and is very jealous, and he's thinking the same thing. So supposedly, DeModi went to the McLaughlins and he said, look, I'll kill Buddy McLean for you, but you either have to allow me to, or you kill O'Toole for me. And the McLaughlins thought about it. They thought, this is a good deal. Go ahead, kill him. So DeModi gets in his car, drives out to Somerville, Mass., and he's to look for Buddy McLean so he can kill him and then get on with his business of killing O'Toole. And he saw a guy that he thought was McLean walking down the street. Who he actually saw was some honest citizen, a guy named Charles Robinson, who was on his walking home, minding his own business. DeModi came up from behind and running up, fires a .22 caliber, but he had almost tripped when he fired, and so he shot the poor kid in the hip. And then he fled the scene. Somehow police found out it was DeModi who shot Robinson. So the next day, the Somerville police, they go to DeModi's wife's house. They bust the place up looking for the gangster. And the wife calls DeModi and says, the cops are looking for you for shooting some guy. So DeModi panics. And he calls the FBI agent called Rico. And Rico says, sure, I'll meet you. We'll take care of this. Well, as soon as they hung up, Rico, this slime bag, calls Buddy McLean. He fills him in on the whole thing. He says, somebody was going to go kill you, blah, blah, blah. And he's going to be waiting at such and such a place. So McLean hops in his car. He sees him, goes there. Demote's waiting in his car for him, fires 3 shots, kills him dead. And then McLean goes and hides out in Agent Rico's house, of all things. Honest to God. There was a series of bad FBI agents up there. Anyway, on September 26th, Carlton Eaton is shot to death in his car. It's in the early morning hours. 2 bullets passed through his head. They shattered the window on the passenger side of the car. Eaton had a recent record for passing bad checks, and he may have been part of the crew that killed Delaney and Hanton, where they torched the guy's testicles off a few months before. He was a pal with Demote. He was a pal with Joe Barboza. They all worked together in a burglary ring. So did Demote's brother, by the way. So there was a tie-in with that. You'll see that theme again and again in cities where all these guys kind of know each other. So in October came the very brutal murder of this guy, Anthony Sacramone. He's 22. He was a narcotics addict, but he was also selling narcotics. He was stabbed 4 times, twice in the neck, twice in the head, shot twice in the back of the head. So there's 2 boys playing baseball on the street, and they find him, his body, he's pushed under the car's dashboard. He was a house painter, but he had a habit of selling dopes to teenagers. He'd go outside a local high school and sell to the kids. So that didn't go over well. But anyway, he was arrested shortly before he was murdered for selling 2,000 Benzedrine and sodium secondol pills to an undercover agent. His killer, by the way, was probably Eddie Deegan. The last murder of the year came in November when the body of this guy, William Trini. It was a small-time burglar. He was a muscle man. You could pay him to beat people up. There's 2 sides to this story. One was he had been a witness to Frankie Benjamin's murder, and they got paranoid. They thought, what if he talked about it? Let's just kill him and that thing. So they shot him, and then they cut him up into 8 pieces, and they put him in suitcases and left him on an empty lot. The other side of that is his roommates and him were drugged up, and they had a fight, and they killed him. I don't believe that. We're going to cover now is part 2 of the Boston Irish Wars. If you look on this channel, you'll find the Boston Irish Wars, part 1, 1964. So if you want to get filled in, go there first and then see this one. And eventually, when I finish, this thing went on for a decade, so it's going to be a while. I'll put them all together, and you can sit back for about an hour and a half and watch them. Also, you might want to watch the Plymouth mail robbery piece I put up here as well, because it explains a lot. A lot of these murders that happened in 65 were related to the mail, not a lot, but some were related to the mail robbery. They just weren't going to pay people. One bad guy shaking down another bad guy who we thought was part of the mail robbery, that kind of stuff. And so corpses are showing up all over the place. Some of the murders that happened here, as you'll hear, were mafia murders. Remy Patriarca, who ran the mafia, really organized crime in New England. Well, out of Providence, he controlled not all of New England, eastern part of Connecticut, most of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, of course. And, his guys, and then ordered murders. And some is just, you get bad guys together, they're going to kill each other. All right. Let me go over this now. The Boston Irish War spilled into 1965 with the discovery of the corpse of John F. Murray on January 10th. Murray was a parolee. He'd been shot in the back of the head, and he was dumped in a vacant lot in Dorchester. Dorchester is an area of Boston. It's a neighborhood. It's not a town. It's within the city of Boston. A lot of people think it's a town. As I read on, you're going to see a lot of these guys get shot in the back of the head and dumped in vacant lots all over the city. Murray's brother, Billy, he was one of 2 men at the time who was facing trial for the murder of William J. Trini, Treani. He was only 23 years old. He'd been murdered. He was a small-time crook. They hacked his body up. They stuffed it in a suitcase and threw it in a trunk of a car. And they left it in the South End, as I said, vacant lot on November 13, 1965. Trenny and Murray, along with two other hoods named Ed Huber and George Ash, were linked to this burglary gang. They broke, listen to this, they made 1,500 break-ins in 18 months. My God. So Ash was the brother of a fairly important policeman. Ash was eventually found stabbed 50 times, shot, and left in a car on the south end of Boston. Ash was fresh out of a Rhode Island prison where he had done time several years as for an accessory to a robbery. As for Huber, that's Huber, it was Trenny who killed him. He told a friend, I just gave Huber his last rites. Huber's remains were found in the Higham Woods 11 days later. They dropped some other bodies in the woods, not Higham necessarily, but so they all weren't left around the city. On January 15th, this guy, Robert Rasmussen, he was an ex-convict from Dedham, and he was found dead on Teenan Beach at 9 o'clock at night. He had been severely beaten, and his head had been battered in, literally, with some sort of a heavy object. There was a single shot they fired through the back of his head. The temperature froze that night, and his body was iced onto the beach, and they had to chop it out of there and get rid of it. It was nearly nude. The body was nearly nude. But in this macabre, weird-ass touch, the killers, they put a necktie around his neck and gave it a Windsor knot, so we'll figure. So why was Rasmussen killed? He's part of the war. On January 23, this ex-con, Henry P. Reddington, he was a loan shark who came across as an everyday regular guy. He was found murdered in his home. He had a real estate office. He was a broker, and he did legitimate deals. But he'd been shot 4 times in the head. His body was found at 3 a.m., 3 in the morning now, by a married mother of 2 children, Dorothy Burchard, who said she just, she was in the neighborhood at 3 in the morning. She dropped by. So she described herself as a close friend of Mr. Reddington. She was later taken into custody, several months later, in New York City as a material witness in the murder trial of this guy, Crazy Joe Donohue. The father of her 2 children was Georgie McLaughlin's favorite slugger, this guy James O'Toole, who I think floated in from Ireland, I'm pretty sure. The gang leader, Wimpy Bennett, had borrowed $25,000 from Reddington, and he figured a way not to pay this guy, pay him back, is he got in touch with McLaughlin gang member Spike O'Toole I just talked about, and he told O'Toole that his wife was having an affair with Reddington, which apparently she was. O'Toole tracked down Reddington and killed him, and Bennett never had to pay $25,000 back. So it was only a matter of time before Reddington got it anyway. The FBI was all over him. They were watching him. I think when that report said FBI, I think they meant the Treasury Department, because he was suspected of being a distributor of counterfeit 20s. These are the same type of fake 20s that had circulated throughout New England and New York in 1961 and 62. And then when the Treasury guys got on the case, whoever it was, probably Reddington, backed off for a year and then started again. Where they followed him to most of the time was his favorite hangout was this bar. It was attached to a North Quincy motel. The government suspected that the hotel had something to do with the counterfeit ring. They weren't really sure, and I think they were going to execute a warrant on the rooms to find out. But, Reddington dead, why bother? In July of 64, I'll give you an example, the bodies of 2 Patriarchas guys, an ex-con, Paulie Colosi and Vincent Bessisi, were found stuffed in the trunk, again, of an abandoned car, again, in that motel's parking lot. Then they found Joe Franconi. He was murdered too. Vincent Teresa, who became an informant against the Boston organization, he wrote a book, My Life in the Mafia. It's a good book. There's a few fibs in there you can see, especially the part about when he was in the army. That didn't really add up. but a lot of people think it's a good book. So Teresa said that Joe Barboza went to Francone's apartment as a favor to his friend Johnny Bullets. Don't know who Johnny Bullets was. Since Franconia had cut bullets out of this deal, and he shot Franconi through the back of the head as a favor to this guy. That sounds kind of far-fetched to me. Anyway, Franconi, here's a more logical explanation, was deeply involved with loan sharks. He owed him his teeth, and that's why he was probably killed. They also said he was a big ladies' man, they being the cops, so that could have been an angle here too. Reddington, Franconi was also a suspect in the mail truck heist October 14, 1962, in Plymouth, Mass. In fact, he was Franconi was around under 24-hour surveillance by postal inspectors. By the way, I know a lot about the postal. I used to handle some records. That's a great organization, postal inspectors. I mean, they are really good at what they do. But they fly really low under the radar. They don't like a lot of attention. They do a lot of undercover work. You have to be smart to get a job with those guys. Anyway, so Francone and his estranged wife, Teresa, were involved in passing forged checks because both of them were badly in debt to loan sharks and there was a drug problem. So after one arrest where she forged a $250 check, they caught Teresa and the judge asked her how'd she have this forged driver's license because it was near perfect. And she said to the judge, if I tell you that, judge, I'll end up with 2 broken legs. Whoa. So in March of 62, the FBI had installed bugs in Raymond Patriarca's office at the Coinomatic Distributing Company on Atwells Avenue, 168 Atwells Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island. It's an old, crappy building. It was an old, crappy building then. If it's still there, it probably still is. It's 2 floors, I think. I used to drive by that a lot, and it was glass windows. I don't know, it seemed kind of, well, of course the windows were glass, but I mean, there was a lot of them. It seemed to me the entire floor was glass. You would think he'd have like curtains or, I don't know, some privacy, but there it was, smack in the middle of the Italian neighborhood, what had been the Italian neighborhood. Anyway, at the end of each day, these tape recordings from Patriarca's office were reviewed by a special agent. He wrote a summary, and then they erased the tapes. Isn't that a shame? The Bureau pulled the plug on the bug on July 12, 1965. I don't know why. My guess would be the bug was in there not illegally, but without consent of a court. They just went in, put the bug in. They had no intention of using the material gathered in a court of law. It was just to gather intelligence. That's my guess. I don't know. Anyway, in the middle of the month, Jimmy Flemmi came to the forefront. Flemmi was this merciless killer for the Winter Hill Gang and the Patriarca mob. He was also an FBI informer, as was his brother, Stephen. The bug in Patriarca's office recorded a hood from Boston named Frankie advising Patriarca that, quote, all the people are getting scared of Jimmy, Flemmi, in other words, that he'd been sent to ask this guy Frankie, to ask Patriarca to talk to Flemmi, calm him down, impress upon him that there should be no more killings in Boston. So the Angiulio brothers, who ran the mafia in Boston for Patriarca, they had already met with Patriarca about this issue. And they told him that this bizarre, I'm going to write more about him someday, gangster from Boston named Frank Smith. He was a weird guy. He was giving orders to Flemmi to hit this, according to them, this quote, hit this guy and hit that guy. Patriarca went through the roof. Smith didn't have that. He wasn't supposed to be doing that without clearance, without consent, but he's doing it anyway. So Patriarca calls Flemmi and Barboza. He says, I want you here in Providence now. I'll meet you. Had these meetings in a garage, parking garage in the city. So that day they came down there. He told them, you are not to take orders from Smith anymore. Patriarca later said that although he had a lot of regard for Flemmi as a criminal, Flemmi didn't in his opinion, use common sense when it came to killing people. Gennaro Angiulio told Patriarca about This is, by the way, this conversation was the same day, about trying to influence clerks on the judge's staff, and Nigelio was certain that the assistant United States attorney was, quote, his boy. Turned out he really wasn't, but around the same time, the bug picked up Louis Taglianetti's talking to Patriarca. Taglianetti is under indictment for the murder of a hood named Johnny Jack Nazarian. Pretty sure I put that we have a show on that here. Nazarian. They murdered him in Providence. So now Taglianetti, he's met with Patriarca. He's in his office and he says, "Look, I'm worried. The FBI seems to be investigating me beyond this Nazarian murder." He told Patriarca he was vague. He was involved in, quote, a hot scheme for the past 2 years, and he was worried about being indicted over that. And he was right. Well, he was right about the FBI. He was right about being indicted. 2 years later, they got him. They indicted him on tax evasion. He would be shotgunned to death in 1970 as he was walking home with his very, very young girlfriend. No, I'm sorry. He was walking out of his apartment, I think it was, in Providence, and they gunned him down. The Agnello brothers had been pestering Providence Patriarca to get, quote, the okay to kill this guy, Eddie Deegan. Eddie Deegan is a Boston gangster. He's in the McLaughlin's camp, and the McLaughlins, again, are one of the Irish gangs that are at war with the Winter Hill gang. Deegan, he was an independent operator. He worked, his front was that he was a longshoreman. He'd been a boxer, and actually he'd been a pretty damn good boxer. But he robbed Patriarca's family's Peter Limon, got $82,000 out of him, robbed his, maybe not the right word, but he got 82 grand out of him. So not only were the Anglos calling for Deegan's head, it so happened that Flemmi and Barboza had also contacted Patriarca, explaining that they were having problems with Teddy Deegan, that he was, going a little too far on too many things, and they wanted to kill him. Patriarca said, "Give me a week, let me think about it." And on March 3, they learned that the FBI learned that Patriarca had okayed the Deegan murder, and that a close associate of Deegan, this guy Roy French, had agreed to set him up for the kill. 9 days later, March 12th, Flemmi was assigned as a to Special Agent Paul Rico. He was going to be his informant. So they met. Rico, who later would go to prison, FBI agent Rico would go to prison. Flemmi, they had lunch. A few hours later, Flemmi takes off to go kill Eddie Deegan. So at 11 p.m., 11 at night, police find they got a call. Deegan's body lying in his back. He's covered with blood. He'd been shot 6 times by 3 different weapons, a 45 and 238 calibers. There was a 12-inch screwdriver near his left hand. He'd been holding that apparently. Deegan was in the middle of breaking into a Chelsea, called the Chelsea Finance Company, into their office. I'm going to say it was in a shopping plaza. I might be wrong, but anyway, he was told that employees had left the door open for him, so he could just walk in when he got there. But it wasn't. He was probably screwing around with the screwdriver. Of course, it was locked. But when he showed up, he was driven there by a friend, Anthony Statsopolius, who was waiting in a car for him to finish the robbery. As he's doing this, Roy French, his so-called friend, steps out of the dark and shot him, and then Joseph Romano Martin and Ronald Ronnie the Pig Casisa came out of the finance company office, and they both shot him too. So while Deegan's getting murdered, Flemmi and Barboza, they're in a car. They get out of the car and they walk towards Tony Stats, who obviously floors it and gets the hell out of there, saves himself. Ronnie Casisa and Romeo Martin asked Flemmi for the murder job. They wanted to get word back to Raymond Patriarca that, in their words, they were capable and ready to serve in his family. So the police show up 11 o'clock. 45 minutes later, maybe less, the Boston field office sends a memorandum to J.R. Groover identifying Barboza, Flemmi, Casillo, and this guy, Roy French, as the killers. I'm going to take a drink of water. I've still got this cold, excuse me, or whatever it is. Some of it's allergies, man, it's just awful, you know? My throat gets sore. So anyway, how they knew that within 45 minutes is amazing. There were no witnesses. All of this, as you can guess, is going to come back and blow up in the Bureau's face in a few years. On April 8th, we're moved along to the next month now. Jerry Angulula, he's one of the brothers who runs Boston Mafia. He's recorded telling Patriarcha that he figured rather, that Jimmy Flemmi and this colorful Boston gang guy named Eddie Wimpy Bennett were, quote, stool pigeons. Well, he was right about Flemmi. They weren't right about Bennett. I'm pretty sure he wasn't a stool pigeon. Bennett was this old-style, treacherous Irish crime boss. He ran a savage crew up in Roxbury, and they controlled the rackets in the South End of Boston and, of course, parts of Roxbury. In the Irish War, he was siding with Winter Hill. The nickname Wimpy came from his, you'd have to know Popeye cartoons. This guys, I'll gladly pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today. That was the character. So he would go to this restaurant and order burgers and never have the money. So I'll pay you tomorrow. But he wasn't called Wimpy. He was called the Fox. I think the newspapers called him Wimpy. It's called the Fox because he was just smart and he knew how to make money and he's always a step ahead and he was a paranoid. Like when he talked to people, he covered his mouth with his hands. Nobody could figure out why. Well, why was he had actually hired a lip reader to watch the mouths of the guys who worked for him, so he knew what was going on. 2 years later, from where we're talking about now, Frank Flemmi, and Steve Flemmi, they'd murder Bennett. On April 12, Peter A. Cassetti, a Medford bookmaker, he was shot to death a few hours before he was to appear as a witness in a burglary case. It may or may not have been related to the Irish Wars. On May 3rd, Jimmy Flemmi, he's on his way to meet Joe Barboza when Stevie Hughes and Punchy McLaughlin, from the McLaughlin gang, obviously. Now, this is according to Flemmi. They shot him as he walked out of his home in Roxbury. He took 8 bullets across the body, and he survived. Stevie Hughes and Punchy, good for them, went into hiding. I don't blame them because they knew they didn't kill him. 2 days later, the Patriarcha microphone surveillance picks up Barboza, Cassettes, Jimmy Flemmi. They come into Patriarcha's office to get permission to kill this guy, Lyndon Lindenbaum of Revere, Mass. They said that Lyndon was underwriting the McLaughlin group against the Winter Hill gang. It's giving him money. So Patriarcha, he didn't say yes or no. He said, I'll get back to you, I'll let you know. But Barboza, who was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, he walked away thinking he had permission to do it. Well, sooner or later, he goes around Boston, hey, do you know where I can find Lyndon? And I need to kill him. And Lyndon hears about this, and he goes to Joe Lombardo, the old mafia guy up in Boston. He says, look, they're going to kill me. I don't know what I did. They call Patriarcha. Patriarcha explains that he calls the hit off. However, they would kill Lyndon 2 years later in 1966. Not too many people get out of this alive, So we're now in July. And on July 10th, Joseph Romeo Martin was found dead in a car in Revere, Mass. They shot him 6 times in the chest. Vincent Teresa later said that Joe Barboza was the murderer. Martin, they called him Romeo because he had romantic themes in his poetry. He was a poet. He won national publicity in 1951 while he was at the Walla Walla prison in the state of Washington. He hit a home run they were having a ball game with the convicts, and he whacked one way over the fence, and the guards are cheering, and the audience is cheering, and so he went out to get the ball and went into the weeds, and he just never came back. I'm sorry, he didn't hit the ball. He was in the field, I guess, and he was playing outfield, and he goes in there to say, I'll get the ball, I'll be right back. He never came back. I don't know if that's accurate or not because it says he escaped while rounding the base. Well, I don't know. Anyway, what he did is, I'm going to get the ball, and took off. They found him 6 months later, 2,500 miles from Boston. That was a big deal. It was a short-lived story. People were cracking up about that. They thought it was funny. In 1953, he tried to flee from the old state prison at Charlestown, but guards found him. He was hiding under a chapel pew, and he was sent back to Charleston, to prison in Washington. This is after he walked off the field. Martin was a practicing poet. He was a short story writer, a prison newspaper editor, aside from being a professional gambler and a thief. He broke into houses. That was his thing. His criminal record dated back to the age of 16. He had spent basically most of his life in prison. In prison, he became a flawless typist, and he was self-taught. He never completed grammar school, but he gave himself a good education. He wrote extensively about criminality, and he was working on an autobiography. He wrote that, quote, because of our disproportionate devotion to searching for the bad in people and the comparative neglect of the humanities, we often ignore the difference between punishment and people. As Emerson says, there is a law for man and a law for things. Too long has punishment and treatment of the offender been seen as synonymous. Through research and understanding, the two must be separate for the welfare of all concerned. It's a little long-winded. I would have edited it. But so in another work written in prison entitled Penal Messiah, Martin described the life, the accomplishments, and theories of Alexander Maconochie, a pioneer who I've never heard of, penologist, prison expert, who was head of the Birmingham prison, who died in 1860. And Martin wrote of that, so passed into eternity, a giant. Good sentence. Martin's body was found less than a quarter mile from his home in the front seat of his expensive red convertible. The engine was still running. The right-hand signal was blinking. The windshield wipers were on. A neighbor heard the car crash into the side of a road, and they called the police. An investigation showed that, like most of the other people, he had fallen into a trap when he was killed. According to Vincent Teresa again, in the time I knew him, Barboza he's talking about, he handled more than 23 murders, most of them on his own. I mean, they weren't ordered by the office being Providence, where Patriarcha was. Romeo Martin is just a typical example of what I mean. This was in 1965 in July. I had been out all day with Castucci and Romeo playing golf. Romeo was planning to leave for Florida the next day with his wife. He'd just gotten married and he was going to Florida for sort of a honeymoon. After we'd played golf, I told Romeo to come over to the Ebb Tide bar for a steak dinner and a couple of drinks. While we were talking, he said he heard Barboza, after busting up a club, had an argument. He said that he'd shaken the owner down for more money than he was supposed to, and that he held out on Barboza. Barboza had found out, and they threatened to kill him. When Martin, went outside, Barboza and Cecchio were waiting for him. They grabbed him, took him someplace, pumped 5 slugs into him before they dumped the body. When the cops found him, Henry Tamilio, I'm still reading, this is a quote from, again, Vincent Teresa. Henry Tamilio, who was a boss in Providence, blew his top. He said, "Why didn't you get hold of Barboza and stop it?" I responded, "Christ, Henry, they were supposed to be friends. Who knows this animal? Who knows what he's going to do?" How treacherous Barboza was. The slightest thing, the slightest word, and he would kill you. When a reporter found Martin's 21-year-old wife of 4 years, Diane, she was a hairdresser, she was in shock. He was so swell to me, she said. There wasn't anything I wanted. Please say something good about him for the papers. For some reason, the FBI microphone in Raymond Patriarcha's office was cut off the same day. In August, we're up to August now, Steve Flemmi finally and Cadillac Frank Slimmy, they climbed a tree along a rural road and waited for Punchy McLaughlin to step into their sights. When they did, they shot him in the hand, badly enough that it had to be amputated. For Flemmi and Slimmy, this is what sort of sneak attack they loved, especially on Punchy. In fall of '64, they dressed as Hasidic Jews. and they lay waiting for Punchy in a parking lot of the Beth Israel Hospital. When he came into view, a shotgun blast ripped off part of his jaw. He survived, only to be shot again in August and again in October. But witnesses showed up before they could finish the job, and he lived to tell the tale. So in August, Waddy Davis, who had been this, at his prime, a big-time narcotics guy, he started handing money out to loan sharks to get money out on the street so he can make money on his money. He had more or less kind of retired and then came back out of retirement. Well, that's lovely, except Wimpy Bennett and Steve Flemmi had their money out with these loan sharks. And so they solved the problem. They dragged this guy, David, into an alley and they shot him dead. On September 10, we're in September now, Joe Barboza was arrested for beating up a Boston cop with a gun at the ebb tide. In other words, that's badly written sentence. Barboza had the gun. He pistol whipped the cop. On September 15th, Flemmi was dropped as an FBI informant after being charged with assault with a dangerous weapon with intent to murder. What he had done was he shot a guy named John Cutliff. They had an argument in a bar, so he solved that by shooting him. Of course, how else would you solve a problem? We're in October now. By the end of the year of 1964 and again 1965, Bostonians are staying in after dark. The shootings have really got that bad. It's just crazy. You know, area-wise, Boston isn't a big place. It's a smaller area, you know. It's not spread out like New York or something. There were 44 gangsters dead. Bodies were everywhere. A headless one in the trunk of a car. Another one was chopped into pieces, rammed into 3 suitcases. Another one in a vacant lot. More than just a few Bostonians had come to believe that they didn't stop because the killings didn't stop because, quote, the cops don't care. The reasoning is that the hoodlums are only killing each other off and therefore ridding the community of an undesirable element. But that's not true. The cops are on these guys 24/7. They were really trying to stop this. But as the Irish-Boston War escalated, the McLeans and the McLaughlins, the Winter Hill Gang and the McLaughlins, started hiring new blood. They brought in new blood from other states into the organization. Several of the guys they brought in were accomplished murderers. The result of that hiring binge was that worsened the shooting, and by early October '65, more than a dozen bodies showed up in the streets, as I just said. And Raymond Patriarca is down in Boston. He's starting to worry about this. Governor John Volpe said he was, quote, amazed and appalled by the intensification of this underworld warfare, and he announced that a full facilities of the state police would be used to stop the killings. Boston police officials recruited more men because they had to get more guys on the street. They put special squads on the street. They ordered patrolmen to search known hoodlums and suspects for anything, for crossing the street, looking sideways, and hold them for questioning. In other words, just bust their balls and make life hard for them. That was an unofficial order, obviously, by the way. They didn't put it in writing. Aside from a greater police presence almost everywhere in the city, the murderers had sent some of Patriarca's best guys into hiding. They don't want to get shot. So that dramatically hurt business from Rhode Island to Boston. People just they weren't making their collections. And Patriarca now, he's pissed. And he's recorded saying, if these killings don't stop, I will declare martial law. Patriarca told Henry Tamilio, his underboss, to arrange a peace conference at the Ebb Tide Lounge in Revere in January '65. Buddy McLaughlin, who was open, Buddy McLean, he's open to negotiating a truce, right? And 2 of his guys, Punchy and Georgie McLean, arrived after carrying loaded pistols in bags. They took that away from him. Tamilio screamed at them. He said, what's wrong with you? He said, if you want to murder somebody, take it out to the streets. The peace conference went nowhere, and Tamilio called Patriarca and told him, look, this is pointless. The only way to end this war was that he, Patriarca, is going to have to choose sides. And he did. Patriarca chose the Winter Hill Gang. Smart move. The new assault started with the Winter Hill Gang, now backed up by Patriarca's organization, which was powerful and rich and had a lot of contacts. And the FBI in the background were also, you know, in a way, kind of supporting Winter Hill as well. At the least, Tamilio got these Irishmen to agree to a cooling off period. And just as the shooting seemed to be tapering off, um, just after the peace conference, Eddie Punchy McLaughlin was shot to death as he boarded a bus in West Roxbury to the murder trial of his brother Georgie. See, without the use of his hand, he couldn't drive, so he had to take the bus to the Suffolk Court in Pemberton Square down in Boston. That's as far as he got. They were watching him. Flemmi and Flemmi were watching him. And they were really determined now more than ever to kill this guy. So they shot him to death as he stood on the pavement with 6 other people waiting for a bus. Can you see that? And there's a lot of people waiting at a bus stop. You know, people tend to stand closer, like foot, 2 feet away from each other. These guys come up and they blow this guy away. They carried a handgun in a paper bag. Punchy had a handgun in a paper bag, but that he kept in his left hand. But he never got to use it. The FBI believes that the killers, by the way, were Barboza and Chico Joe Amico. It was the third and final attempt to murder poor Punchy. He'd been seriously wounded in a shotgun attack outside his Brookline a hotel in Brookline. Later, he was ambushed. There was a bullet shattered his arm. His hand was amputated, as I said, at the wrist. Shortly before his death, he had it outfitted for an artificial hand, but it still looked really weird. You know, at the time, they weren't so advanced. One story had it that Punchy was killed right after he tried to shake down suspects in the Plymouth mail robbery to get money for his brother's murder defense trial, which is why the FBI believed the killers were from outside. On October 31, Buddy McLean, the man who beat up Georgie McLaughlin at the Salisbury Beach 5 years ago and started all this craziness, was caught outside a cafe on Winter Hill, torn apart by shotgun rounds to the head, chest, and he's dead. His 2 bodyguards, who never saw Stevie Hughes leap out from the side of him being a movie house theater, were both shot with an automatic rifle. McLean tried to duck behind his car, but Hughes shot him in the back of the head. A waiting getaway car was waiting. Stevie Hughes hopped in and he was gone. In November 15, McLean killers Barboza and Flemmi found Ray DiStasio, a McLaughlin gang member, just was inside the Mickey Mouse Lounge in Revere Beach Boulevard. So they walk in, they shot him dead. They also killed this guy, John O'Neill, who was a shoe factory worker, a father of several children, otherwise upright guy. He just had, being in the wrong place, wrong time. Vincent Teresa wrote, Barboza went into the club searching for him. Well, we know that. And he caught DiStasio cold. The trouble was a poor slob named John B. O'Neill, who had a bunch of kids, walked in to get a pack of cigarettes. Barboza killed them both because he didn't want any witnesses. DiStasio's got 2 in the back of the head, and O'Neill got 3. It's a shame. I mean, this O'Neill was a family man. He had nothing to do with the mob. Barboza should have waited. That's why he was dangerous. He was unpredictable. When he tasted blood, anyone in his way got it. Wow. So anyway, a few hours later, police found the dead body of 35-year-old Robert Palladino. He'd been shot through the head under an elevated highway near Boston Garden. Palladino was murdered by Johnny Mauritano, the first of his 19 murders, because Palladino had seen Jimmy Flemmi commit a murder, and they didn't want him alive to talk. I don't know if you could hear my dog yawning back there. So while the murders reached fever pitch in 1965, the central players behind the war were either dead or in jail, or just too shot up really to do anything. On November 19th, Jimmy Flemmi was convicted of armed robbery with intent to murder. They sent him to Walpole Prison in Massachusetts until 1969. With the McLaughlins basically dead and gone, the brothers Stevie and Connie Hughes took over the Charlestown gang, and the war would continue.
Corner in East Boston was a magnet for desperate people who needed money fast and couldn't get it elsewhere. Interest, or vigorish, was high, and the collection methods were low. But Barboza claimed he always warned the customers first.
When we made the deal, I tell every person, don't take this money if you can't pay it every week. I prefer you not take this money because it can lead you into trouble.
If a customer did take the money and couldn't pay it back, there was trouble.
This was almost typical. If a guy was 7 weeks late, say in the area of six or 7 weeks late, and he was hiding, and I found him, I threatened him, and I told him that you better come down the corner and straighten this out. Now the fellow would continue hiding because he didn't have the money. And I could not like accept. I could not let myself accept that he was in trouble. So that I stabbed guys after 14 weeks that still continue to hide. You know, I stabbed them in the face, I stabbed them in the legs, I stabbed them in the arms, I stabbed them in the chest. You understand?
Barboza and other loan sharks justify this kind of treatment on the basis of the deal. And surprisingly, they say even the recipients of the violence agreed.
See, most of these people, the ones that I heard, knew that I was right. Maybe I was wrong in the way that I did it, you know, as far as the excess violence that I did it, but still they said that they deserved it. They didn't relish it, but they knew as far as the deal itself, they were wrong.
The money made on loan sharking is enormous. For example, Joe Barboza had just one corner and one section of East Boston.
It grew up to $5,500 a week. Interest.
How much money did you have out to get $5,500 a week?
Well, I was a little lucky. I only had about $65,000. I had one man that I gave $21,000 to, and he used to give me $1,800 a week.
There are some freelance loan sharks, but very few successful ones. The successful sharks are soon paid a visit and are usually made an offer they can't refuse.
You start off with $1,000. That ain't nothing. Once you start making some good money, that's when they step in on you and say, listen, we'll give you the right to Shylocking. Shylocking belongs to, you know, to the office. And you've been doing Shylocking for a long, long time.
Excuse me, Joe, what do you mean by the office?
To the office, in other words, it goes an entree. They wait till you make some money. Then they say, all right, we're your partners. We want 50% of your business. Any trouble that you have, we'll take it. You don't have to hit nobody. You don't have to do this. They didn't do that.
What do you mean hit?
I mean, anybody, you know, what they use. What they use if they hit you, you know, slap you, stab you, hit you with some kind of an implement or... I'm going to tell you something. If anybody died from Shylocking, it'd be a $90 customer. It won't be a $5,000 customer because that doesn't get you your money back.
In the structure of the New England mob, Barboza's position as a contract killer required direct contact with the man said to be the boss of the New England crime syndicate, Raymond Patriarca.
Now, imagine, like, Raymond sits in Rhode Island. This ashtray is Rhode Island. And there's that's the middle of a wheel. And all these folks run out, lines of them, into Worcester, into Springfield, into Boston, and all these different cities and suburban towns. Now, when the lines go there, he has an office there, the main office in each town or city. Now, in that main office, there might be 25 25 chartered clubs or bars, more than that, in that city, that all turn back to that main office. Now, the main office sends somebody back towards Raymond, and at a certain point, not directly to Raymond, but to somebody Raymond trusts just outside Rhode Island, picks up that money and brings it to Raymond. And you got all these people, you know, you understand what is developing from this main artery, that thousands of people that he controls in the way of bookmakers and so forth, and the runners and so forth, and pickup men. And gambling is, you know, they're not wrong in regards to the 5 cent or 3 cent number money. You understand that, you know, when it deals in volume, it brings it back millions and millions and billions of dollars a year.
The indictments last week against Boston's alleged mafia leaders confirm that such structure still exists as described by Barboza, and that Raymond Patriarch of Providence, Rhode Island, is the boss of that syndicate. Barboza described the simple way that members of the syndicate are identified to each other.
Joe, this is Jim. Jim is our friend. Joe is our friend. Understand? Or they'll say, they never, if there's somebody that's not connected, they never say our friend. I want you to meet so-and-so.
It was some of these same so-called friends who double-crossed Barboza and caused him to turn informer and to go on to become the most important witness against the mob ever. Here he reads from an undelivered letter to Patriarca, citing his reasons for doing so.
They killed Tash and Tommy DePrisco in the nightlife. They took off their persons money totaling over $70,000, which belonged to me in regards to the bail. Killed Chico on December 7th, 1966. Raymond sent word to me that if I go to his office and straighten it out, then nothing would happen to my wife and child. They did plot and try to kill my wife and child. The office tried to kill my brother. They tried to kill my wife's cousin, Sid. They turned attorney of mine against me, and he was opening letters I was sneaking out through him and letting them read them. The office spread the rumor that they were mad at me for shaking certain people and nightclubs down, even though I never moved on any club or person until the office gave me the okay. I only answered to Raymond and his emissary. At first it used to reach me, the informant of Canary Bay. It doesn't reach me anymore, because I have a purpose in life. I have only one purpose, and that is
A convict describing himself as the grandson of a mafia don has given a Senate panel an inside view of the workings of organized crime. Mariah McLaughlin reports.
Vincent Charles Teresa has 28 years' experience in the criminal world. He was involved in illegal gambling, loan sharking, and he trafficked in stolen cars, credit cards, and securities. Teresa, now serving a 5-year prison term, gave the Senate Investigations Subcommittee the benefit of his wide-ranging knowledge of the underworld.
When you speak of the mob, when you speak of that, are you speaking of a definite ring or group of people who are engaged in professional crime as you have described throughout your testimony?
Yeah, I'm talking about a definite syndicate operation tied up all over the country and outside of this country too, that strictly starts with gambling.
It all starts with gambling.
All starts with gambling. Without gambling, they got nothing.
And you say they cannot operate without the police knowing about it.
They cannot operate without it.
And do you find that they do actually have police protection where they operate?
Positively.
Are they confined to any one ethnic group?
Yes. They're all in one organized...
No, you don't get what I mean. I'm talking about the Italians, Irishmen, Polacks, or Germans, or what? Are they confined to any one nationality?
The bulk of them are Italians. There's no question about that.
I see.
But the Jewish people that some of the most successful bookmakers in the country are Jews.
Yeah. Are they top people in the organization?
Some of them are, yes, sir.
Some of them are.
Yes.
So it is generally... It was originally, as I understand it, it was the mafia, which was strictly Italians.
Right, years ago.
But now then it has expanded somewhere. Some other nationalities are actually in the organization.
Right.
Teresa said why he decided to tell all about his former colleagues.
The FBI convinced me that I was a fool, and they were 100% right. They were doing it to me, and not just in the federal cases, in the state cases. They had informers going in on me and making it miserable for me. They wanted to give me 100 years in a case up in Boston. They convinced me that it was just a question of time before they killed me. And they were right. If I didn't do what I was doing now, I would have eventually get killed in prison.
That's the final judgment and disposition, is it, of this mob?
That's it. Get you out of the way completely, so you don't cause no more trouble.
Very well.
Why did they want to do that to you? You were a pretty good operator for them, weren't you?
But my people went to jail. Henry Tamilio and Raymond Patriarch were in jail, see?
I see.
Before I went away. So I had no one fighting for me anymore out there.
If that happens, can't you make a deal with another a mob outfit and get in with them?
No, you can't trust them. They're a shady bunch of characters.
There's no question about it. You have to have support from the legitimate, or so-called legitimate people, bankers and brokers and so forth. Without them, you're nothing. Just having the paper in your hand doesn't mean a thing. Because if you were just to pick up a piece of stolen security and walk into a bank by yourself and say, I want to cash this, they'd have to investigate you. But if you walked into a banker that's a friend of yours and say, hey, I want to make an 80% loan on this security, all he does is he puts it in a brown envelope and puts it in a vault, you see, and he gives you the money. If you look into their background, you'll find out that every one of these guys that have helped you has got bad habits. He either likes to gamble, he likes to play with broads on the side, he likes to keep an apartment for another girl, you know, he's probably married, and he wants to live a double life. He wants to go to work every day with the white shirt and the black tie on and look nice and happy and clean. But underneath, he's just as bad as I am because he's stealing just like I am. I'm on the other side of the law now by choice and by force, let's put it that way. But if I had a mind to right now, I could make myself $2 or $3 million by the middle of October.
And if I didn't have my case coming up, I'd like to come back with you gentlemen when this is over with and really lay the law down, what's going on in this country.
Boston Irish Wars poured into 1966 like nobody's business. The FBI saw this and they looked at the bigger picture. There was complete chaos on the streets of Boston. It seemed as though no one was in charge of the underworld. Patriarch was still running a tight ship, but the FBI saw an opportunity. They started to squeeze his organization from the top. So he's got madness on the street, FBI squeezing him with the Justice Department, and the state police. They're putting the pressure on him. The idea was eventually he'd make a mistake. He'd slip up. And when he did, he'd take his organization with him to jail. So the Bureau began to spread rumors across the United States with the other mob families that, you know, maybe Patriarch was losing control over New England. Maybe these guys who were out shooting up the streets were really in charge. Oddly enough, in the long run, one of those shooters took over the Patriarch organization. So it was sort of true, although they were just making it up to put it on him. In July of that year, Patriarch wanted to make sure the underworld understood he was still in charge. He was the authority. And he ordered the needless execution of a guy named William Arfio, who was a Providence bookie, obnoxious Providence, but was still the same. In January 1966, Joe Barboza was arrested. He punched a cop. They got him for illegal possession of a firearm, possession of marijuana, disturbing the police, plus hitting the cop. So he brought in a young F. Lee Bailey out of Hartford, who managed to have him put all the charges put off except the least serious one, disturbing the peace. In March of '66, Jimmy Flemmi got sent to prison for 4 to 6 years for armed robbery with intent to murder. So that left a big hole on the streets. Also in March of 1966, Connie and Stephen Hughes, the brothers, drove to Connie's house out in Malden, where they were ambushed probably by Joe Barboza and Joe Chico Mico, his constant hanger-on. A lot of other people say it was Wimpy Bennett. Even Stevie Hughes didn't know for sure who it was. Hughes was wounded in this. Stevie Hughes was wounded. He had to go to the hospital for a month, and eventually his spleen was removed. His brother Connie escaped, but barely. When the cops showed up, they said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, you fucking stupid." He got shot, and then he walked away. Tony Varanis and David Shylocking. They were both from Dorchester. They had records. They were out drinking at a bar, and they weren't seen again until they turned up dead 1 day away from each other, April 25 and April 26. Varanis was an ex-boxer who left the ring in 1958 after he had a match with Joe Devlin. He probably had brain damage before he went into the fight, but Devlin delivered a terrible beating. It was a real barn burner, that fight. He left after that. He had serious brain injuries. Shylocking, who was with the Warehousemen's Union, was shot in the head 3 times with a stolen Army .45. A man digging for clams found the pistol, and the police figured, well, the body must be nearby. They found it the next day at the bottom of a deep embankment off a highway. Police determined that Varanus had been on his knees when they shot him. He was badly beaten around the head and the neck, maybe after he was killed. Ronald Jackman, another Dorchester guy, was indicted for the murders, but he was released from the charge. The actual killer was more than probably Johnny Materano. The story was that in April of that year, Varanus was out drinking. He comes across Materano. Words are spoken. Varanus reaches for his gun in a waistband, but Materano draws faster and shoots first, and he kills Varanus with one bullet. And then he drove the boxer's corpse out of town to Milton and dumped him over there. On May 25, 1966, the McLeans, they got word that Connie Hughes was inside a Charleston bar. He was in a sour mood. He's looking for the guy that ambushed his brother. Joe Barboza probably got together a hit squad of 2 cars and waited outside. The reason he was able to do that is inside the bar, an up-and-coming hood, Brian Halloran, was in the bar, and he managed to get word out that Connie Hughes is there and he'd be leaving shortly. By the way, Connie Hughes beat that young guy, I don't have his name, whoever it was, for 1 hour, and he stabbed him in the legs with a fairly long knife. So a little past midnight, he's had enough. Hughes gets in his car. He drives away towards the Mystic River Bridge. And there's a toll booth there. And the Barboza guys follow him. Just past the toll booth, 2 cars. Barboza's probably in one. They come zipping up alongside Connie Hughes' car. They fire 60 shots. Remarkably, only 2 bullets hit Hughes, but they hit him in the head and they killed him. And that's a big blow to the organization. On June 15, 1966, Rocco Di Siglio was murdered. He'd been a professional welterweight as well. He was associated with the Patriarca family in armed robberies and gambling while he was in the ring. In 1964, he left the ring and he started to do holdups of high-stake card games, dice games. And he did it mostly in Newton and Lowell, upper-income areas, but those games were protected by the Angulo brothers out of Boston, and they knew who was robbing their games. Because DeSiglio and the others didn't bother to wear masks. They just walked in and robbed the people. Joe Barboza was later told the FBI, he later told the FBI that the Angulos had told 2 men who they had working under them and had been robbing the games with DeSiglio, Bernard Zena and Richard DeVincent, that they gave him a choice. We know you're working with this guy. We know you're robbing our games, even though you're on our payroll. So you either murder him or we murder you. It's your choice. So that was an easy one. A week later, Zena and DeVincent left the bar with DeSiglio, telling him they planned to pick up a stolen car for a robbery they had planned. They drove out to a dark street and they executed DeSiglio at close range, 3 shots to the head. DeVincent fired the shots. They drove to Topsfield, the town, and dumped the body in the Ipswich River in the wild sanctuary just outside Danvers, Mass. DeVincent would later be murdered by unknown members of the Patriarcha mob in Medford, Massachusetts on April 3rd, 1966. On July 13, 1966, Willie Marfeo, this is the fellow we discussed earlier, was a Providence bookie, kind of a loudmouth, and he decided that he would take advantage of all this warfare going on in New England. He'd strike out on his own. And he started to operate gambling operations on Federal Hill in Providence, which was, when I was a boy, was the Italian neighborhood, but was where Patriarcha's office was. But Marfeo, he's 46 years old. He's got an arrest record that goes back to 1940. He just doesn't seem to give a damn. Patriarcha didn't want it to be a regional hit because it could be brought back to him. He calls up this gangster, Joe Paterno, in New Jersey, who sends up a killer to take care of Marfeo. He sends up Butch Miscelli and members of his gang out of northern New Jersey. Marfeo's shot. He's eating pizza at the corner kitchen restaurant in Providence, and there's a single gunman walks in, tells him, get into a phone booth over there, shoots him dead. There is a video on that here on this site. You can look for it. On July 24, Barboza, he's 33 now, Nick Flemmi, Joey Miko, they get into a fight at a night spot in Revere with this guy, Arthur Pearson. He was a doorman at the place. This fight was just part of his ongoing problem between Barboza, his crew, and this guy Pearson. As Pearson and his girlfriend walked towards the car, or a girl, I don't know if it was his girlfriend, walk to her car later on near the beach. Barboza and the other two are waiting for him, and they've got knives. They're waiting out with their knives out. So, and they say, we don't like you, guy. And someone comes up from behind him and stabs the guy. So he was rushed from the hospital. Amico was probably the one who stabbed him. He's rushed to the hospital, and police arrest Barboza and the others because the girl talked. However, Pearson refused to answer even one question in court. He claimed protection of the Constitution by declining to answer questions that may harm him. It's kind of a stretch of what that law was intended to be, but whatever. By the end of the summer, the judge eventually jailed him for refusing to testify. But anyway, once again, Barboza and his guys walk away untouched. By the end of the summer, Stevie Hughes was running the badly beaten up McLaughlin gang, and he's thinking about suing for peace. He was badly outnumbered, badly outspent. He knew he wasn't going to win this war, so he reached out to Winter Hill Mob. He began discussions about ending the war. But before he could do anything, before anything could be arranged, Barboza and Chico Amico found out that Hughes and a loan shark, a bad loan shark named Sammy Lindenbaum, were headed over to Lawrence, Massachusetts to work in the gambling numbers games over there, lottery games over there. 2 miles outside the town of Middleton, a black sedan suddenly appears out of the side of the car Hughes is driving. A gun barrel points out the backseat of the window. It's Frank Flemmi. He fires, he hits Lindenbaum in the hand. Lindenbaum loses control of the car and he heads towards an embankment. Stevie Hughes reached for his gun, but he was cut down in a hail of bullets. The car slid down an embankment and into a swamp. Hughes and Lindenbaum were both dead. However, just a weird point was Lindenbaum had these 2 little dogs with him, 2 miniature dogs, and they leaped into the back seat when the gunfire started, and they hid under the chairs, and remarkably, they lived through the shootings and the car crashing and so forth. Johnny Jackson, he was a bartender, was gunned down on September 28 as he parked his car in a poorly lit area behind a row of apartments at around 3 in the morning on September 28. The killer shot him 5 times in the lower back and twice in the head. He used a shotgun and a pistol. Jackson was the late-hour bartender at a downtown restaurant, Luigi's, in the South End. In 1964, he was working the night shift when the body of a waitress, Margaret Sylvester, this gorgeous blue-eyed blonde, was found in a loft over the restaurant by police. He hadn't done it. He hadn't had anything to do with it. He was unlucky enough to be there when she was murdered. She'd been stabbed 3 times in the abdomen and then wrapped in a rug. And someone called the police and told them that stolen furs could be found in the apartment above the restaurant, and that's where Sylvester was, of course. She'd only been dead a short while after the police arrived. The day before she was murdered, Sylvester was in Luigi's restaurant. She was a waitress. According to witness, was in, quote, in a loud and argumentative mood with Jimmy Martirano, the brother of Johnny Martirano. She was probably drunk and was leaning on Martirano, and at one point fell off the bar stool. Martirano told her to go home. She did, but she came back the next night and resumed the argument, drunk again, with Martirano, who may have been with his brother at the time, maybe. Anyway, John Martirano was known to carry a knife, and he could use a knife. He more than probably used a knife on a guy named Jack Bano in the 1969 murder. Police figured that the brothers stabbed the girl, carried her 3 flights up this narrow set of stairs, because getting her out to the car to dump her someplace else was going to be a problem. There were onlookers. Martirano admitted to murdering 20 people, but he said Jimmy the Bear Flemmi murdered Sylvester. But who knows? On the one way or the other, there were 2 witnesses to this cold-blooded killing, Bobby Palladino and Johnny Jackson. They couldn't have him, Jackson being the bartender. They just couldn't let him go like that. So what they do is Bobby Palladino was a former convict, an armed robber. He was a friend of John Maturino's in 1962. Wimpy Bennett and Steve Flemmi told Maturino that Palladino was bad-mouthing him all over about this murder, about murdering his waitress, how they didn't have to do it. It was cold-blooded, blah, blah, blah. So John Maturino said this. So I have to believe that when Stevie Flemmi, was telling me I had to kill this guy, Palladino, to protect my family. The reality was I was killing to protect his family, his brother, Jimmy the Bear, whom Maturano insisted did the actual killing of the waitress. John Maturano collected Bobby Palladino from the street. He drove by. He said, "Hey, come on, get in the car." He did. At that point, Maturano got in the back seat. The car was being driven by someone else. Maturano got in the back seat, which you would think Palladino would wise up to that, but he didn't. And when he did, he fired a single bullet through Palladino's head. He killed him, and he dropped the body. Barboza is riding high at this point. He's got a lot of growing power, but he's out of control. He's reckless. He's power mad. He won't pay attention to the rules. The patriarchal people are beginning to warm up to him that maybe they could find a place for him, which is all he wanted. He wanted to be a made guy very badly. But the problem is he doesn't understand the rules, and he won't abide by the rules. I'll give you an example. He walked into a place that was under mob protection, and he said, "Well, congratulations, you're paying me now, not them." So it was that sort of behavior. And the fact is, he was so splashy. He was a loudmouth. His murders, the cops knew about, brought in a lot of attention. So by mid-1966, the Justice Department is looking at him. The FBI is following this guy. Massachusetts State Police want a piece of him. Boston State Police Department, they all want this guy. And that weakens his position with the patriarchal family. They're just thinking, this guy got to go. He's a problem. You can always find a murderer. He could be replaced. So the cops knew this much about Barboza, that in 1964 until 66 at least, he laundered money from outside New England. They knew he drew two salaries. One was from the insurance company called Shylocking in Boston, where he was on the books as a salesman, and the Blue Bunny Lounge and Duffy's Lounge also paid him as a PR consultant. In 1966, October 6, 1966, Barboza, Nick Flemmi, Patrick Fabiano, Trash Brastos, they're driving through the combat zone. A slew of cop cars pull them over. They search the car. They know exactly where to look. They find an illegal and unregistered Army M1 rifle, a loaded .45 caliber pistol, and a knife. So at the time, Barboza and Flemmi were out on bail in connection with a stabbing, and they think the knife is connected to that. Because of pending court action and a new charge of illegal possession of firearms, the judge, who's well aware of who Barboza is and wants him off the street as much as the cop do, sets the bail at $100,000. Barboza's sitting there thinking, well, that's all right. Patriarchal's lawyers will show up any minute now and bail me out, but they didn't. Then later on, he learns that Patriarchal's guys more than probably set the whole thing up. They sent him on a mission into Boston, into the combat zone, and told the cops what color car he'd be driving, where he was, and so forth. So they slam him away in jail. That leaves Brastos and DePrisco, a friend of his, well, two of his guys, to try to raise the cash to get him out of jail. So there's two versions of what happened. One is that on November 15th, everyone agrees on that, Brastos, who's a loan shark, and DePrisco, who is his enforcer, walked into the nightclub lounge, the North End Club, and demanded a share of the club's take. That part is doubtful. That it probably isn't what happened. Because the place was owned by Ralphie Chong La Matina, who was part of the Zanino crew. La Matina was a powerful guy. He ran narcotics for the Patriarchal organization. He's protected. He was also a leading suspect in the loud and splashy 1950 murder of George Killeen. DePrisco apparently says, "You're going to pay us." He says, "No." So DePrisco, according to the story, leans over and slaps La Matina in the face because he was laughing about being shaken down. Brastos and DePrisco were lured back to the bar, the nightlife cafe, and then murdered. Their bullet-ridden bodies were found in Brastos' Cadillac, parked on a street corner in South Boston. An informant later told the cops that they plopped the bodies down there in South Boston because they were hoping it would mislead the cops into thinking this had been an Irish problem and not with the mafia. The same informant told the police that the killers had robbed both of the men, Brastos and DePrisco, of about $35,000 of bail money that they had raised for Barboza's release. Oh, and both of the bodies found in the cat, like Brastos and DePirsco, had been badly battered. The faces were swollen from being kicked. Another version of this, probably the right version, was that Brastos and DePrisco were told to come to the nightlight to meet Larry Bione, who would give them money for Barboza's bail. As a good faith measure, they said, bring what you got here. Everyone will kick in, and we'll make sure we have enough to the $100,000 to get him out on bail. Stupidly, they bought into that. Brastos, DePrisco, Chico Amico, and Patsy Fabiano, they walk into the club, which is closed, and they find at least 12 of Patriarca's guys, including the boss, Larry Zananino, waiting for them. The others were Ralphie Chong, John Sinacata, Ralph Wagenheimer, and Bione, of course, along with the bartender, Joe Lanza. Lanza turned out was an FBI informant, rather. So Brastos and DeFisco are the first to step in. They're shot dead immediately. Amico and Fabiano run like hell and they escape. An informant said later, look, to put it simply, they were rocking the boat and they just fell overboard in the process. So, to close out the year, Joey Amico was murdered on December 8th. That night, Amico and Jimmy Kearns, who was bad news, he was a South End bartender, were in the infamous combat zone. They were into a bar there. They were scheduled to meet somebody. It's common knowledge on the street that Amico and 5 other hoods were on a hit list by the mafia, that the police had given a copy of the list, and they knew about it as of December 1. The others on the list were probably Barboza, Nick Flemmi, Patrick Fabiano. Boston police had Amico and Kearns under surveillance early in the night, but then they gave up on the surveillance, let him wander. They go to this bar in the combat zone, and there's a guy, Frizzy. Frizzy and his brother Connie, they were East Boston hoods, were originally Barboza's partners. There was a falling out. Everyone had a falling out with Barboza. And Barboza and Brastos bought him out. Brastos is now dead, of course. Amico was overheard talking to Fritzy. He says, as a plea, he says, Fritzy, please straighten it out. This is my life. You've got to straighten this out. Fritzy told him that they would go to a Revere night spot, a nightclub out there, and all of the problems they had would be cleared up. Somebody was out there going to meet him, and they'd be given money because these guys were starving. They had no income now that Barboza had been in jail. Kearns is suspicious because Fritzy, he says, displayed a, quote, unusual nervousness. Among other things, Fritzy drank 6 scotches during this very brief meeting that they had. So Kearns leans into him, grabs him, and says, this better not be a setup. And when he wouldn't answer him, he punched him in the face. The 2 guys, Kearns and Amico, they leave the bar in the combat zone. Around 12:40, they drove out to Alphonse's Broken Heart Club, a second-floor lounge near the corner of Tremont and Stewart Streets in Revere. About an hour later, when Kearns drove away from the Revere night spot with Amico on the passenger side, another car pulls out of the parking lot where they were and pursues them. A second car comes up. There's a blaze of gunfire from the pursuing cars, armor-piercing rifle bullets that riddled the Kearns rented car. The car smashed down a telephone pole before it came to a halt. Amico's dead. A bullet in the back of the head pushed out his eye. Kearns had superficial wounds, but he was fine, remarkably. Police found that D'Amico In 1967, the shooting portion of the Irish Gangsters in Boston came to an end. But you know, the ramifications of this long term went on for about 2 more decades, and it dramatically altered the way organized crime was going up in New England. The murder of Stevie Hughes in 1966 didn't end the warfare, but the eventual murder of all the Hughes brothers did. It eventually finished off the McLaughlin gang. Howie Winter would take over the McLeans, and then Whitey Bulger, as you know, would succeed him. So it was 67 was the last year of the shooting portion, but it didn't end quickly and it didn't end peacefully. It started with the January 15th murder of Billy O'Brien, William L. O'Brien. He was only 40. He was the 38th victim in the gang war since 1964. By the way, that number of 38th gang, that's the bodies they could count, the cops could count. Who knows how many of these guys ended up as fish bait in the ocean and it never made, pardon the pun, a ripple on the stats. O'Brien apparently had stopped his car to talk to someone. He rolled the driver's side window down halfway. It was two neighborhood kids across the street were watching. When he did, whoever he stopped to talk to jammed a 38 into the half-open window and put 6 or 7 bullets in the left side of O'Brien's head. The bullets passed through his body, smashed the passenger side window, got stuck in the door. They powder burned his body too, his face anyway. O'Brien was out on a $25,000 bail for armed robbery, but also for passing counterfeit monies. And the rumor was that O'Brien, when they got him for passing bogus money, he said he found the money in a car he had stolen. Well, yes and no. He didn't just find the car. The car apparently belonged to a made member of the Patriarcha mob who more than probably had the counterfeit money in there, who, and no doubt O'Brien knew about it, and that ended up as a result of his murder. O'Brien had served time in Danbury Federal Pen in 1956 for a bank robbery. In early January 3, actually, 1967, they got him on an $86,000 holdup of the Sitka oil terminal over in Quincy, Mass. He had been arrested a lot in the past. Mostly he enjoyed hijacking. That was his thing. So he ended up dead, and then the murder of the three was really just a matter of time before somebody took out the Bennett brothers. They just walked. They stepped on too many toes. You know, they were asking to die. It was Edward, Walter, and Billy, the three brothers. They were all murdered in '67. They found Billy Bennett's body was the only body they ever found. He was dumped in a snowbank. They put a bullet through his brain. Edward, they called him Wimpy, and Walter just vanished. Flemmi and Flemmi said they did it, but they could never tell the police where the body was. So a lot of that may have been ego. You know, I'm a big bad gangster and I shot this really bad Bennett brothers, or maybe they were covering for someone. But if they were, why? So I think they probably just lied, basically. So they did loan sharking mostly, a lot of gambling. Some of it was run out of Walter's Lounge, but most of it was, that was the name of the place, Walter's Lounge, named after Walter, no doubt. But a lot of it was in a place Wimpy owned called Dudley Lounge at 247 Dudley Street in Roxbury. That was the scene of a lot of bad things. There's a guy named Andrew Pappas was knifed to death there in '64. What had happened was Jimmy Flemmi may have had something to do with it. He took the body, dumped it in a gutter. When the cops showed up, he said, I don't know. This guy was walking down the street, and two guys knifed him and ran away. So they didn't want any problems with their licensing, among other things. What else happened? Let me see. Oh, Georgie McLaughlin came in there with his buddy O'Toole, tried to bust the place up. And Frankie Benjamin, another hood, was murdered there. Eventually, the place was set on fire. Aside from that, the brothers ran a very lucrative racketeering enterprises in Roxbury, Dorchester, South End of Boston. And apparently they had a piece of everything that went down in Roxbury. They also rented themselves out when needed as enforcers and collectors for loan sharks who didn't want to get their hands dirty. Again, while they were all partners, the three brothers were partners in this. Wimpy was the boss. He had been the boss since the 50s when he took over. They were conniving, treacherous, old-school Irish hoods. They called him Wimpy, by the way, because he ate a hamburger every day virtually at this place in Tremont. But the Italians didn't see him as a cartoon figure, the mafia. They called him the Fox because they knew he had this remarkable ability to make money at the slightest opportunity, and that opportunity usually rose out of some sort of tragedy. And because he had no qualms at all about turning a buck on the back of his fellow gangsters. He just had no loyalty to anyone. Henry Reddington, I talked about him in a prior tape. Someone had gone into his home out in the suburbs in the early morning hours at 3, 4 in the morning and shot him to death. He had been a wealthy broker, but he was basically a loan shark. We learned later that what happened was he had Wimpy Bennett had borrowed 25,000 from him, and he got 25,000. He goes to Spike O'Toole, who was with the McLaughlin gang. He said, by the way, this guy Reddington's fooling out your wife. So whether he was or what, who knows? O'Toole tracks down Reddington and kills him. So now Bennett's got $25,000 you don't have to pay back. And the murder went down, Reddington, as another victim of the Irish gang war, which it was, but, it really was just a clean murder. Unlike, like his brothers, Wimpy was paranoid really to the extreme. He probably wasn't too tightly wound together. He was also extremely careful. When he spoke in public, he covered his mouth with his hands or with his newspaper, he always said. By the way, all three brothers always carried loaded weapons with them. Wimpy also hired lip readers from across the country so they couldn't be recognized. And he'd have them follow around the Italian gangsters and read their lips and report back to him what was going on. They had aligned during the Irish Wars. Bennett's aligned with the Winter Hill Gang. Of course, they were the winning side. And the original Roxbury crew included Flemmi, both brothers, the Bear and the Rifleman Flemmi. Frank Flemmi got his start with them. He hired him when he got out of the Army in 1955. And he taught Steve Flemmi, he taught him all the ropes, how to be a loan shark and so forth. When the Boston Irish War started to spiral out of control, Bennett used the war to kill off his enemies one by one, or anybody who bothered him, and without drawing suspicion to himself. So he said, well, they were obviously a victim in this war. And they weren't, just somebody he wanted out of the picture. He was seldom smiling. He was very vain. He always wore a hat because he was going bald. When he couldn't wear a hat, he wore a wig. The Boston cops took it from him once, and he sued, tried to get them. He said it cost him a lot of money. No one in mobdom trusted Wimpy, obviously, for a lot of reasons. But he did operate with the blessings of Raymond Patriarca, because he visited Patriarca regularly down in Providence with big bags of money. I mean, he knew how to stay safe. He was subpoenaed to give evidence in Boston's Brink robbery before a federal grand jury because he was caught red-handed with some of the Brink's money, more than $50,000. Federal agents found the cash hidden in a cooler inside a fake wall in Wimpy's office in the South End. In June of 1956, Wimpy and Fats Buselli were arrested by federal agents, and they did jail time for having the Brink's money in their possession. It was one of the few times Wimpy was slammed behind bars. He and his brother more or less escaped unjail for most of their careers. How they got the money, where they got the money, who knows? They were probably, my guess is they were probably going to wash the money, clean it for whoever took it. The theory was he didn't do any jail time, by the way, because he was an FBI snitch. But that rumor is going to happen anyway in mobdom. You do a lot of bad guy stuff, especially on his level, and you never go to jail. Something's not right. But if Wimpy was an FBI informant, then he would have known who pulled off the Brinks robbery, which the federal government desperately wanted to know. They took years trying to get the names of the heist, who was involved, but they never really learned much. So if Wimpy was their guy, he would have handed them all that information, and he would have gotten a lot back in return. So was he an informant? I don't know. George and Eddie McLaughlin guessed that Wimpy had helped in setting up the failed murder on their Edward McLaughlin. So Jimmy O'Toole and allegedly Francis Murray, who worked for the McLaughlins, tried to shoot and kill Wimpy when Wimpy stepped out of the front door of his home. O'Toole was hiding really close by in these bushes, and he jumps out and he fires a shot, and of course, being O'Toole, he misses. Wimpy throws himself back into the house. He pulls out his ever-present revolver. He fires, and then he runs out the back door. So Murray is sitting in the car, and he's supposed to wait, obviously, till O'Toole hops in the car and they drive away. He's got the engine idling. But when the shooting starts, Murray panics, and he drives off, and he leaves O'Toole there. So he drove off when he realized that Bennett wasn't killed, and that immediately he knew they missed. His life is in danger now because Bennett was not going to overlook this thing. Murray essentially disappeared, not by his own design, shortly afterwards. Wimpy vanished in January 67. He was probably murdered, probably by Steve Flemmi, at the urge of the mafia capo Larry Bione. Killing Wimpy served a lot of purposes. Mostly his rackets fell directly into Flemmi's hands and the mafia's hands. There were probably two other reasons. First, according to John Motorano, Bayonne wanted him dead because, one, he was Irish. Two, they thought Larry was sneaky. They figured Larry was going down to Providence, ratting them out over everything to Patriarca. And but on the same hand, there is FBI surveillance of that same year telling his people, look, be careful of Wimpy Bennett. He's a sneak. Stay away from him. So I think they just wanted his. He made the mafia guys nervous, and they wanted his rackets, and it was that simple. You know what's he gonna do if they kill all the brothers? There's only three of them, and there's God knows how many mob guys he had behind him. Who's gonna stop him? What are they gonna go to police? So Wimpy, who he had this reputation of being dour and dangerous and deceitful. Members apparently of the Boston Mafia approached Patriarca and they said, "Look, we don't trust this guy." So they, one way or the other, they had to have gotten Patriarca's permission for the murder. So another story was that Steve Flemmi had accused the gang's bookkeeper of stealing money from the rackets. Flemmi took the guy, he puts a gun in his mouth, and he tells the bookkeeper, "What's going on? I need to know." And the bookkeeper says, "Well, Wimpy Bennett's stealing from the accounts." Flemmi and Flemmi, they called a meeting to sort this thing out, and they tell the bookkeeper, "Say what you said now." And Bennett's in the room, and he says, "Well, Bennett's been stealing money." So Wimpy, apparently, now this is according to the guys who were there, his mouth went dry, he couldn't get a word out. He never got to explain. Flemmi put a gun to his head and fired, apparently. They buried his body at a firing range, supposedly, that they'd been using for target practice over in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. Then Flemmi turned state evidence, and as part of that deal, he had to point out where he buried Bennett and his brother as well. But so he sent law enforcement here and there, and they dug around. They never found the body. In April, so you have to wonder, was it ever? He said, "Well, it's there. Maybe they moved it or something like that." The thing about it is, some reporter pointed out, this is January in New England, the earth is like cement. You just can't dig a hole. Trust me, I know this. And so where was he? In April, Walter Bennett went out looking for Wimpy, and he never came back. He ended up dead, we assume. That left Billy. On December 19, Richie Grasso picked up Billy at his home, and they drove with him. They got a few feet down the road when he ended up dead. Billy was also aware always of it. He was always suspicious, and he had a rule: don't ever get in a car with anybody you don't know or trust completely. Stupidly, I guess he trusted Grasso, which was the mistake of his lifetime. He was shot inside the car within several minutes. The force of 4 of the bullets to the side of his chest, it propelled him out of the car and into the snowbank where they found him. And this is in Dorchester, where they found him. Less than a mile from where Grasso had picked him up. The pistol he carried was still in his holster. Bennett is thought to have been killed because he had been searching for clues on the disappearance of his 2 brothers. They expected that. Mott thought, well, he'll want to do this. But apparently what he had done was he had hired outside gunmen to come in and settle the score, and he was talking with the police because in his view, he had a legitimate legal problem. His brothers were disappeared and more than probably killed. So he was going at it 3 ways. He would try to find who did it. He had guys out on the street with guns trying to find out who did it and then kill them. And he figured, why not have the cops looking on this too? That crossed the line. Grasso disappeared immediately after it hit. His body was found in a trunk, of course, a week later. No one was ever convicted in either murder, Grasso's murder or Billy Bennett's murder. In 1970, several suspects, including a Boston detective, were tried for the murder, but sometimes the bad guys win. There were 2 murders in February. The one I've covered in another tape, so I won't go into a lot of detail on it. It was Andrew von Etter. Etter, they called him the Baron, and were ridiculing him, was was an associate of Wimpy Bennett. Uh, he said he was born in Lithuania. His great grandfather was a war hero in the Russo-Turkish War, and that his father was German nobility. He immigrated with his parents in 1947 in Boston. He became a security guard at a warehouse which had a safe in it, so he figured, I'm here, I may as well crack the safe and make off with the money. The short end of this is that the Bennetts, Walter Bennett, introduced Van Etter to a murder for hire thing, a woman in Florida. As I say, there's a tape on this in here. Florida, she wanted to get rid of her husband. Van Etter did it. The police got Van Etter's name. It was probably a matter of time before they backtracked and led that to Walter Bennett. So I guess Bennett figured we'll just kill Van Etter and block that trail. So that's what that. On February 2, John Locke, he'd been a close pal of Connie Hughes and his brother Stephen. He was murdered. He was the 40th murder in the Irish gang wars. He was a bartender, sometimes a longshoreman. He was with Connie Hughes just days before Hughes was murdered in May. A few days later, Locke, probably drunk, barges into the Charlestown Cafe. He's got a gun in his hand. He's shouting, "Just tell me who took care of Connie and I'll take care of him." Well, that didn't happen. Two customers beat him with baseball bats, threw him out in the streets. Somebody shot him 4 times in the head, once the head, the face, the chest, and they dumped him about 100 yards from a rapid transit station in Revere, Mass. Next, on April 18th, came Joe Lanzi. He was a South End bartender, but mostly he was a police informant. He reportedly told the police about the murders in the Nightlight Cafe in the North End when somebody offed Trash Brastos and Tommy DiPersico. 2 police officers were in Medford, were driving on their patrol. They saw a car gun right through a red light, so they gave chase. The driver doused his lights, cut into the neighborhoods. The cop followed him. They ran him off the road to the side of the road. About a half mile later, the guy who was driving, it was more than probably this hood named Carmen Gagliardi, he leaped out of the car. The cops came out and said, "What are you doing? You're going like a bat out of hell. You went through a red light." So Gagliardi, if it was him, said, "You know what? I got to go in my house here just for a minute. My license is in there, and I'll be right back." And he starts to walk away without waiting for permission. So as he does that, the 2 officers peer in the car, and the guy sitting behind the driver's seat, bear in mind the driver's door is open, he kicks the seat up and runs like hell. And when he runs, Gagliardi, who was now on the passway up to the house, he took off. They disappeared in the dark. The third passenger, this guy Frank Orito, really bad guy. He was sitting on to the right of the driver in the back seat. He tried to get out. He couldn't. The cops caught him. They tossed him back in the car. And that's when they know. Orito, by the way, was a loan shark, a professional killer for hire. He worked for the Angelillo brothers up in Boston. Carmen Gagliardi, the driver who fled, they were partners in their loan sharking business. So the cops look, and there's Lanzi's corpse seated in the front on the passenger side, obviously. He's slightly slouched. His head is back, and he's leaning against the window. They look closer, and they see this guy's dead. He's been shot once in the right ear, and there was a lump, probably the slug, that was bulging above his right eyebrow. So they found another bullet wound in his chest later on. The cops searched the car. They found 2 guns, a .38 revolver, and a .38 double barrel over and under Derringer. I don't know what that is. There were hardly any bloodstains in the car, so he had killed someplace else. They tossed him in the car, and they were probably driving out to the marsh areas in Medford to drop him there. Lanzi didn't have a police record, but he was known as a small-time numbers runner. He ran favors for the mafia guys. About 6 months before he was killed, he had been stabbed in a Boston bar, reportedly by some hood, and he spent several weeks in the hospital. Orito was taken to a station house. He's booked there for the murder of Lanzi. Orito's only arrest occurred in 1958 when he was arrested in Revere, Mass, oddly enough, on an attempted rape charge. Continued on into the summer of =67. On June 27th, Richard Camarada was found shot to death in a sand pit in Boston in the summer, June 27th. His hands had been cuffed behind him, and he'd been shot in the back of the head. He was the father of three. He was number 44 on the Gangland executions in the Irish Wars. He was generally described by the police as a decent sort of guy. He had no police record. Camarada owned the Jolly Chef restaurant until he sold it a month before he was murdered. Police confirmed from their sources that he was not in debt to any loan sharks, gambling. Whoever killed him intercepted him as he left his home to drive to work in Boston. His car never left its driveway. Evidently, the killers grabbed him as he stepped out of the house by surprise, just shortly before 7 o'clock in the morning, and they cuffed him. They drove him down to this gravel pit and shot him 4 times in the back of the head. The handcuffs were stamped Detective Romo V 6440, but that didn't go anywhere. Why he was killed, I don't know. And then on August the 16th, Fred Young, he became victim number 45. He was found face down in a Mystic Valley Parkway in Medford, Mass. 2 bullets in the back of his head. One was behind his ear and one was at the base of his skull. He was the 3rd corpse found in Medford that year, and they'd all been murdered gangland style. A story making the rounds was that Young was in big debt to loan sharks, and he was killed when he just was unable to pay them. But police discounted that story. They said he was too poor to risk loan sharks, and loan sharks wouldn't have been interested. He had no way to pay them back. So why he was killed, who knows? Young spent a short life, just 38 years in obscurity. He drifted from job to job. He was a paper hanger for a while. He served time in jail for passing bad checks and for drinking. He drank mostly alone in bars in the Somerville Square. He was paroled from Walpole's State Prison in 1966 for passing bad checks. And that was the only sort of crime he ever committed. He lived with his mother, so he's another mystery death. On December 1, John M. Havlin was killed by 7 bullets, and he was gangland number 42. His body was dumped in a remote section of the Jamaica Plains. 4 bullets were fired into the back of his head, just like all the others, although they did shoot him in the chest and abdomen. He was shot while he was sitting down, so he's probably in a car, and then they dumped the body just a few minutes before it was discovered, because when police got there it was still warm. He was only 29. He had a police record that went back 14 years, including 2 terms. He spent his life drifting from job to job, town to town. He was on the fringe of society. He was sentenced in 1961 to 68 years for a $1,300 armed robbery of a liquor store in Medford. He was paroled 2 years later. He was returned to prison in 64 for another parole violation for carrying a loaded pistol and burglar tools. And then in the early 60s, Havlin was known to police to be a contact guy for Buddy McLean of the Somerville gang leader. At the time of his death, Hamlin was free on a $1,000 bail for a probable cause hearing on several charges, including threatening a cafe owner and a bartender, ham-fisted attempt to shake down a bar in Cambridge. He walked in and he said, "I'm going to take this place over." He slapped the bartender. He says, "I'm going to take over. You're going to pay me $100 a week." Well, it doesn't really work that way. What the police found out is that a week before he tried to shake this place down, he had gotten a pretty bad beating over in Cambridge. He probably, they think, owed money to loan sharks he wouldn't pay off, and they just thought, well, we're not going to get our money back, so we'll take some blood out of this guy. Apparently, he went to the police and he said, "This is the guy that hit me." So they had the name of the guy that worked him over. Some people think that's why he was killed. I don't think so. I think he went into a protected bar in Cambridge. They were protected, who knows, by the mafia, some independent group maybe. And he just tried to shake down the wrong place. Richard Grasso, I had discussed him earlier on. He's the one who took Billy Bennett for his last ride. And Grasso, who was 34, he ended up dead. They found him in the trunk of his Buick. He was known as just a 2-bit punk. He was really not a lot about this guy that anybody cared about. He was in the trunk. His pants were gone. He was facing up, 2 bullets in his head. The car had been towed to the Brookline police garage. And then somebody smelled the corpse and they opened it, and there he was. Police theorized that Grasso was killed basically for betraying Billy Bennett. 3 hours before the Grasso was killed, Walter Elliott, who was 28, another minor underworld figure, was under police guard in Boston City Hospital with 2 gunshot wounds to the stomach. Elliott escaped in what police regard as a rare instance of faulty underworld marksmanship. Elliott was gunned down shortly after 9 p.m. while walking the corner of B and 4th Streets close to his home. Less than 3 hours later, police believe an attempt was made on his life to prevent him from talking about something. Elliott he was a convicted robber, armed robber, and he had a lot of other crimes under his belt, starting as early as 1957. He was sentenced to the Concord Reformatory, where he was implicated as a ringleader in a riot led by convicts. He started the riot. Elliott was taken out of Concord in 1953 to stand trial in Middlesex County on a charge of assault with dangerous weapon. He was convicted and sentenced to 9 to 10 years at Walpole State Prison. It was at Walpole he believed that Elliott met his associates in Gangland.